Okay, so this is going to be our first video of this wrap-up weekend series for Euro. We left off Friday with talking about nationalist and separatist movements. We talked about Chechens, and we also talked about Bosnians and the Serbians and so forth. So now we're talking about the Bos briefly. We mentioned how under Franco they were taking a lot of their autonomy was taken away in general. But a group called the ETA, whose name stands for Basque Homeland and Liberty, formed in the 1960s to resist Franco and fight for independent Basque state. During and after the Cold War, ETA engaged in attacks that resulted in the deaths of more than 800 people. Support for the ETA decreased in the 21st century. In May of 2018, the group announced its intention to formally disband. And so essentially the Basques are not as prominent anymore, but they were, throughout the 1900s, a big group that were trying to break off and become independent from Spain. I don't have them all listed, but there's other areas that try to break off just to kind of be aware of them. In Denmark, you have what's called the Faroe Islands, who want to break off. United Kingdom, there's talk about Scotland going independent. In Belgium, there's Flanders. We talked about that earlier in this year in European history. They talked about going independent. In Germany, there's Bavaria, which used to be a bigger state back in the Holy Roman Empire days. Italy has South Tyrol, Tyrol. Italy also has Veneto, Veneto. France has Corsica, which is an island where Napoleon was born. Spain has Catalonia, which they actually very recently tried to vote themselves out of Spain. And Spain also, of course, has the Basque country as well, too. Okay, so we're going to totally shift gears here. So we're going to kind of get into a lot of random stuff now, that just kind of a cleanup of random things the AP test wants to cover. So we got into philosophy a while back with the last unit, Unit 11. One we didn't cover, and I was saving for this unit because it doesn't really start until the 1970s, is what's called postmodernism. In the 1970s, philosophers used the term postmodernism to mean the general reaction to the ideas of the modern period, which lasted from the scientific revolution of the 16th century through the middle of the 20th century. In addition to its use in philosophy, postmodernism referred to movements of the late 20th century in architecture, art, and literature. In philosophy, postmodernism was a reaction to the certainty about the world expressed in the ideas of the Enlightenment. Postmodernism was skeptical about humans' ability to know anything for certain about the world apart from the individual's perception of it. Therefore, it questioned the existence of objective truth and the ability of reason to discern it. In general, postmodernists claim that language, scientific theories, and historical analysis do not represent universal principles or objective truths, but constructions by particular minds in a particular time and place. In addition, they saw that the application of science and technology did not always make society better. So postmodernists saw that logic and reason had used these tools for terrible purposes, especially in the atrocities of World War II. So just because you're logical or reason-based doesn't mean you always get the best result. Like we said, you get the World Wars. World Wars comes out of industrialization. And so it doesn't necessarily always yield the best results in general. So I have on here kind of the evolving attitudes. You have Enlightenment for a long time, for about 200 years, and you have modernism, then you have postmodernism. Postmodernism starts around 1970 and runs to present. So I'll kind of run through the three ideas real quickly. So for Enlightenment, it's an application of reason and the scientific method to political, social, economic, and religious institutions. A rational questioning of prevailing institutions and patterns of thought. A general belief that human progress was possible. So that's Enlightenment. Modernism, the doubt that reason was sufficient to explain people and nature. A belief that people need to take responsibility for their lives. A sense of despair and anxiety about a depersonalized world. That's a result of industrialization, the world wars, and so forth. And then you get postmodernism in 1970 onward. Questioning of objective truth and the role of reasoning in determining it. A belief that ideas once thought objective were instead the creation of humans in a social and political context. A belief that science and reason were not inherently a force for good. So postmodernism's belief that all truth was relative to the observer of an action or event was a direct echo of Einstein's and Heisenberg's ideas about observing scientists' effects on physical phenomena that they studied. Because we talked about how these guys said, everything's kind of relative to what you're doing. If you're looking at something like the atom or the subatomic particles under a microscope or a light, it might affect how you see it. So you can't always actually see things as they're actually happening. Okay. So now we're getting to some more random ideas of like the benefits of costs of science and technology. Okay, so kind of a lot of broad stuff here, but we're going to go through and best we can. Science and technology made life better for many people. Inventions such as home appliances made life easier. Improvements in transportation include the railroad, the automobile, and the airplane. From the assembly line to computers, people use technology to make workplaces more efficient. All of these technological advances had both benefits and costs, especially in the areas of medical advances and military technology. Many people questioned whether the costs outweighed the benefits. Medicine became increasingly scientific in the 20th century. New medical theories and technologies improved the quality of life for many and increased life expectancy. For example, the development of antibiotics, medications for fighting bacteria, allowed for such successful treatment of many types of infection. Continued development of chemotherapy drugs improved cancer treatment and increased survival rates. Knowledge about genes that make up an individual's hereditary traits led to social experiments in population control and new diagnostic tests and treatments that could be tailored to individual patients. These advances, however, raised a variety of questions, and people did not always agree on how to address them. These questions and responses to them range across religious, political, and philosophical perspectives. So before I go into the next thing, which is social questions, I'm going to give you your first Easter egg for watching these videos this weekend. If you send an email to my email, ryan.southall@zacharyschools.org, just in the title, just give me the name of your favorite monarch. You'll get some bonus points. So the first 10 students who do that and send me the name of their favorite monarch through my email this weekend will get 10 bonus points. Moving on to social questions. As life expectancy increased, the percentage of the population that was elderly also increased. The aging population, along with the new but extensive drugs and technologies, increased the cost of health care. Because most European nations had established some sort of national health system, healthcare costs were a high cost for government. For example, in Germany, by the early 21st century, healthcare accounted for more than 10% of the country's gross domestic product, and 77% of that was financed through the government. National healthcare systems were designed to provide healthcare to everyone. Europeans debated how to finance advanced technologies and treatments and allocate them fairly. A related social issue was unequal medical care within the European Union. Each country set up its own healthcare policies. For example, in countries such as Greece, Spain, and Portugal that faced government cutbacks during the economic crisis that began in 2009, life expectancy decreased and doctors sought better opportunities in other countries. For these reasons, patients often traveled throughout Europe seeking better care than they could find in their own home countries. All right, and the next will be the last topics for this video, and we'll go to the next video. Moral questions. Changes in philosophy and technology raise questions about truth and morality. If all knowledge was relative to the observer, could any moral standard apply to all people in all circumstances? If all actions had unpredictable results, could any statement about cause and effect be considered true? The lack of agreement on morality and truth sometimes ignited fierce controversies over new technologies that enabled people to intervene in the basic processes of life. So we're going to go through these different ideas that become very controversial, where you kind of play God almost, where you're playing with science and medicine in terms of like creating babies or preventing babies or doing genetic research and these different kind of things. So first is birth control. By the 1990s, contraceptive pills were the most common method used by Europeans to prevent pregnancy. Often, pills were provided for free or at low cost by government health care programs, which that's not always the case here in the United States. Abortions. In the 1960s and 70s, many countries in Europe reduced restrictions on abortions. In many countries, women could obtain abortions, but the conditions varied widely. Strongest opposition to abortion come from Roman Catholic Church on moral grounds. So today, the country in Europe that has the strictest rules on abortion is Ireland, as you can see on this map here. There's some restrictions in places like Finland and Great Britain, Iceland, Germany, but all these areas in green, which is the majority of Europe, have no restrictions on abortions. You can have abortion at request, essentially. Eugenics. In the early 20th century, some people began to advocate for policies known as eugenics, which they argue would improve the genetic quality of the human race. For example, they supported forced sterilization for people with disabilities. The Nazis adopted this policy as part of their plan for racial hygiene to promote the Aryan master race. because of the association of eugenics with the Nazis, it is widely rejected. But this is something that goes actually back before the Nazis. These ideas come back to turn of the century. Like in America, there's Theodore Roosevelt and people from that time period who talk about these ideas about kind of perfecting the human race and almost like breeding people essentially to make the human race better. But because the Nazis got into all this with the Holocaust and everything else, it's become a very taboo subject in general. Okay, fertility treatments. Medical efforts to help couples conceive children began in the 19th century. In England in 1978, the first child was born through in vitro fertilization. In this process, an egg is fertilized outside a woman's body and then placed inside her uterus to develop. While some people thought this process was unethical, others welcomed the possibility of helping couples have children. Then you have genetic research. European researchers were leaders in genetic research to explore how changes in a person's genes might be used to cure certain diseases such as cystic fibrosis and leukemia. This research generated debate about the possibility of dangerous side effects in using genes. Some feared it would lead to human cloning or the production of human embryos that are genetically identical to a parent. Stem cell research. Other aspects of genetic research, such as stem cell research, have been debated as well. Stem cells are general cells that can divide and change into specialized cells such as blood cells or skin cells. Some scientists saw in stem cells the potential to treat many diseases, while other people objected to the use in research of human embryos that were discarded during the process of fertility treatments. So that's the whole moral issue behind doing stem cells, is most times you get them from embryos, which means they might come from, as I just said, from fertilization tests, as well as like abortions, and the whole idea about when does life start comes into play, and should you be using these cells, even though they can treat diseases like Parkinson's, are they beneficial, or should you ethically do this? So we'll stop the first video there, and we'll pick up the second video